Hello everyone, it's Wednesday and you're watching Within the Frame. I'm Kim Bo-kyung. North Korea this morning fired two short-range ballistic missiles into the East Sea, perhaps as a reaction to the inaugural meeting of the Nuclear Consultative Group between Seoul and Washington, and the arrival of a U.S. nuclear ballistic missile submarine at South Korea's port city of Busan. The launches come less than a week after Pyongyang last Wednesday fired a Hwasong-18 solid-fuel ICBM. Now, what are North Korea's intentions, and is coming back to the negotiating table no longer an option for the regime? To discuss this, we invite into the studio Doctor Go Myong-hyun, Senior Fellow at Asan Institute for Policy Studies. Dr. Go, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
All right. And we also have Brian Myers from Dongseo University. Professor Myers, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
All right, now first question to our Dr. Go. Pyongyang fired a Hwasong-18 solid-fuel ICBM last week during the NATO summit, and again in the early hours of today morning, it fired two short-range ballistic missiles. Now, what can we talk about this intention and timing of such launches?
So North Korea is always trying to send a message behind each provocation. So the timing of the launch of the Hwasong-18 coincided with the NATO summit in Vilnius in Lithuania, and clearly North Korea wants to send a message to the rest of the world that North Korea is still in play, that it cannot be ignored, and also that it has the nuclear capability to threaten the wider world. But also, I think there are other motivations behind the test of the ICBM Hwasong-18. So I think North Korea also trying to achieve technical milestones in this case. North Korea had first tested out the Hwasong-18 solid fuel ICBM back in April, and then it was a successful launch, but then it didn't meet certain technical benchmarks. This time around, only 3 months after the first launch, North Korea had a much more successful test. So, for instance, it reached a much higher altitude than the previous one, which implies that the complete range, when it's launched at a normal angle, is capable of reaching the continental United States as well as the east coast of the United States. So, and also it's a solid fuel engine, so it's another technical milestone for North Korea. So I think that these are the two motivations behind North Korea's recent Hwasong-18 test.
Right, I see. Now, Professor Myers, so our Dr. Go already briefly talked about it, but the last time we saw SRBMs fired was back in March, while the ICBM launch on July 12th, which is last week, was the second solid-fueled ICBM launch since April. Now, as far as I know, the missile flew for 74 minutes at an altitude of over 6,000 kilometers. Now, has there been any noticeable advancement in the performance of both kinds of weapons since the previous launches?
Well, to start with the short-range ballistic missile last March, the general consensus at that time was that it had been tested more as a political statement than in order to test any significant new capability. And I think that was true of the most recent SRBM launches as well. As your news report made clear at the top of the hour, the main effort was to signal dissatisfaction with the arrival of the nuclear submarine in Busan. So this latest ICBM launch was certainly more significant as a marker of technical progress, and the test was a great success, not just because the Hwasong-18's flight lasted longer than it did last April, but also because it rose higher before falling, which is really important because it indicates that if you fire the missile at a lower angle, at a different trajectory, in other words, it can reach anywhere in the continental United States. And this is great news for the Kim regime, and it's kind of a restoration of face for Kim Jong-un in particular, after that fiasco where the South Koreans managed to salvage the body of the ICBM from the Yellow Sea. And it marks a step forward for the nuclear program, but it's not a particularly large step forward because really the capability to strike the United States had arguably been reached already. But if any doubt was lingering in the minds of American observers, or any hope, to put it another way, I think that's been dispelled now.
I see. So there were indeed some sort of advancements made. Now, Dr. Go, prior to the latest provocation, the U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said that Washington remains concerned about the additional ICBM launches and the possibility of nuclear test. Now, this itself is not that surprising, but against what backdrop do you believe Mr. Sullivan brought this up?
So clearly, the United States is always watching North Korean behavior. But I think one of the concerns that the United States or South Korea have right now is that North Korea, especially Kim Jong-un, might be under pressure for the makeup for the loss of face due to the failure of the space vehicle launch back in May with the Sullivan 1. And North Korea had promised to follow up with the failure with another launch, but they haven't been able to do so. And there are news reports that Kim Jong-un was very upset about the failure and is essentially purging some of the specialists responsible for the development of this space vehicle. So I think that could have been one of the explanations behind the North Korea's faster than anticipated second test of the Hwasong 18 in order to make up for the failure earlier. And also I think North Korea is trying to make up for the lost ground this year because compared to last year, the pace of provocation by North Korea has slowed down a great deal. And there are clearly perceptions that the North Korea is not that important in the list of priorities for the Biden administration, and it has a less of an influence in what's going on in the region. I mean, partly is due to the fact that North Korea is also not reaching out to its neighbors, not putting enough effort in engaging diplomatically with the international community. But then I think in North Korea's own mindset, they are probably afraid that they are being forgotten. So I think so there are many different ways North Korea could go about restoring its position of influence in the region. And one of the red line provocation will be the nuclear test. But then it has a lot of downside for North Korea. If North Korea carries out a nuclear test at this juncture, will be tantamount to declaring that there will be no dialogue whatsoever with Washington or Seoul for the foreseeable future. And then it will really strengthen South Korea's hands in terms of strengthening the extended deterrence measure with the United States. So I think this is one of the reasons why North Korea might be considering the nuclear test, but then also being held back because of these concerns.
Right, I see. Now, Professor Myers, regarding North Korea's reaction, the sister of the North Korean leader, Kimia Zhang, is maintaining a stern posture and recently even said that denuclearization is not a realistic way to go. And given that Pyongyang did not send its foreign minister to the recent ARF yet again, does this show it is no longer an option for North Korea to come back to the negotiating table for now?
Well, the foreign minister doesn't put in very many appearances around the world. And if you're going to be very selective about where you turn up, I don't think the ASEAN regional forum is going to be very high on your list of priorities. But I don't see that as an indication that Pyongyang has shut the door forever on the possibility of negotiations with the United States. Kimia Zhang is indeed maintaining a stern posture and playing the bad cop, if you will. But that's the role she's been given to play pretty much since the Hanoi summit failed in 2019. And the very fact that the most hardline statements are generally made by her and not by her brother Kim Jong-un directly indicates to me that he wants to maintain the option of playing good cop in the future. But, we should be under no illusions here because in accordance with every step forward in the nuclear and ballistic program, just like this successful Hwasong 18 launch, the regime expects a more substantial signal of goodwill and compromise from the White House before it will return to the negotiating table. And of course, the question is whether North Korea will ever seriously discuss denuclearization, even if it does come back to the talks.
I see your point. Now, Dr. Go, I'd like to also tap on the alliance between Seoul and Washington. It is getting stronger than ever before. And in fact, the two countries held an inaugural meeting of the Nuclear Consultative Group just yesterday in Seoul. Now, what discussions took place and what significance does this have? Well,
clearly, there's a certain political symbolism around on the meeting with the Nuclear Consultative Group, or NCG. This is actually sends a very strong signal to North Korea that there's clearly an intention on the part of the United States to respond to North Korea's nuclear threats with with nuclear means. And I think besides the meeting, South Korea was paid a visit by the nuclear submarine, USS Kentucky. It's different from the earlier nuclear submarine, which didn't carry a nuclear ballistic missile, but this time around the USS is known to carry, or at least capable of carrying, nuclear-tipped ballistic missile that's launched from a submarine. So these are essentially in messaging system, messaging going on from Seoul and Washington towards North Korea, that the extended deterrence is getting stronger. And we have to pay attention to the name of this consultative mechanism. It's an NCG, not an extended deterrence consultation group. So the fact of the matter is that we have a term nuclear being used to this consultative mechanism. This hasn't happened before. Even though the bulk of the agenda items that's being discussed in these meetings are substantially not that different from the previous meetings, such as EDSG, Nuclear Extended Deterrence Strategic Consultative Group. But then the term nuclear denotes that in case North Korea further increases its nuclear threats by further developing its nuclear and missile capabilities, then the United States and South Korea might consider much more augmented response measures that could involve much more powerful responses, which could also include nuclear weapons being deployed back in the Korean Peninsula.
Right. So
these are essentially a subtle message that's going on between Seoul and Pyongyang. And I think it is clearly acts as a pressure on Kim Jong-un right now.
Right. The name itself is showing that Seoul and Washington is not going to overlook Pyongyang's nuclear threats. Right. Now, Professor Myers, the trilateral alliance is also deepening. And as a matter of fact, Seoul, Washington, and Tokyo staged a trilateral missile defense exercise in international waters in the East Sea on Sunday. Now, how is this three-way alliance developing?
Well, Japan and the United States, I think, are going to continue pursuing three-way cooperation, regardless of which leaders come to power in Washington and Tokyo over the next few years. But South Korea, let's face it, it will likely stop participating in that kind of exercise the moment the nationalist left returns to power, the opposition party. So I'm not all that confident in the prospects of this informal three-way alliance. Let's remember, it's not a formal trilateral alliance yet, consolidating over the long term. But as you've reported, of course, Busan just played host to a U.S. nuclear submarine. And I think that over the next 2 years, at least, there will be additional efforts to project a stern trilateral face to Pyongyang. But with South Korea's ruling party in the minority in the National Assembly, and the opposition still making hay out of the whole Japanese nuclear wastewater issue, I don't expect any great formalization or deepening of this partnership in the short term.
I see. Now, Dr. Go, I'd like to also tap on the relationship between ASEAN and North Korea. ASEAN has seemingly close relationship with North Korea, but the latest statement issued by the ARF expresses concerns over North Korea's recent provocations. Now, what does this hint at?
Well, it clearly shows that the level of isolation that North Korea finds itself in right now in the international community. And it shows that North Korea's nuclear and missile developments are now paying the dividends that North Korea expected. So North Korea is not being considered as a major power because it possesses nuclear and missile capabilities. On the contrary, North Korea is being treated as an international pariah. So the reason why the ARF, or like ASEAN Regional Forum, has condemned North Korea's behavior is because ASEAN is one of the few regional mechanisms that had essentially, I would say, a more charitable view of North Korea's behavior. There are countries in ASEAN that are pretty friendly, had actually had a pretty friendly relationship with North Korea. And these countries had a more, I say, like a positive disposition towards North Korea's statements or like claims that they are developing nuclear weapons for its own defense. But as this time around, I think the ASEAN countries have essentially realized that North Korea essentially broke, it's essentially crossed a red line for them because they, in fact, they put quite an effort to have North Korean participation in this year's ARF. North Korean foreign minister didn't show up, and also North Korea timed the test of the Hwasong 18 with the ASEAN Regional Forum. And then also there are previous instances where North Korea had crossed the red line in a major way, such as the killing of the Kim Jong-nam by using chemical weapon banned by the chemical weapons convention in Malaysia back in 2017, 16, sorry. So these are, and also there's other major gross violation of sanctions that affected ASEAN countries' interest. So these are combination of previous instances of North Korea disregarding ASEAN's interest, and I think the Hwasong 18 coinciding with the summit essentially reached the last straw that broke the camel's back.
Right, so ASEAN countries are now thinking that they cannot overlook North Korea's such actions, right?
Exactly.
I see. Now, Professor Myers, I'd like to also tap on China and Russia's support for North Korea. UNSC meeting was held after North Korea's missile launch, but Washington and other members failed yet again to hold Pyongyang accountable for the launch due to the opposition from China and Russia. What is the reason behind such consistent support for the regime?
Well, even when the Chinese and Russians were on pretty good terms with Washington, let's say 10 or 15 years ago, they would still use their veto power to prevent the Security Council from condemning North Korea for nuclear or ballistic provocations. North Korea has depended so heavily on aid and trade from those two countries for over 70 years now that neither the Russians nor the Chinese see its nuclear program as a problem for their own security. So now that America is arming and supplying a country at war with Russia and pressuring other countries to join the American trade war with China, we can hardly be surprised that neither Moscow nor Beijing really wants to do Washington any favors in the UNSC. As they see it, as the Russians and the Chinese see it, the trilateral cooperation between the US, South Korea, and Japan in the region, which we've just been talking about, raises the need for trilateral cooperation between Moscow, Beijing, and Pyongyang. So the Security Council is not going to be condemning North Korea for the foreseeable future.
I see your point. Now, Dr. Go, so that being said, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, he also urged China to play a bigger role from escalating the situation and asked to, do some more, right? But what do you believe Washington is asking China to actually play, and do you think this is possible?
Well, first of all, I think there's always this expectation that China could play a possible, but actually positive role in stabilizing the regional situation, or, for instance, exercising influence over North Korea to at least pressure North Korea from further carrying out its provocations, or even engaging denuclearization altogether. But then those expectations are proven to be wrong. So we've been disappointed by Chinese, I would say, lack of interest or lack of effort in stabilizing the situation. And I think the reason is very simple. I think China finds North Korea's nuclear and missile development favors its strategic interest in the region. There's no doubt about it. I mean, North Korea's nuclear and missile developments have been going on for at least 3 decades. But then it had a linear progression. China has never put enough effort to hold North Korea back in that sense. And I think it demonstrates that the Chinese government finds North Korea's WMD development allows it to expand its influence in the region, because it's portrayed as possibly an honest broker that could secure the situation for the international community. But I think what's really going on is that the Chinese government finds that North Korea's behavior serves its strategic interest, but on the other hand, it pretends that it remains neutral because North Korea is a very toxic player in the international community right now. It develops nuclear weapons and missiles. It's very threatening to the international peace. So it tries to keep North Korea at a distance. So I think, but then this still gives an impression to some observers that China could be an honest broker, and I think it's wrong.
All right. Professor Myers, I believe this will be our last question. So very briefly, North Korea's envoy to the UN also made their first appearance and requested to be allowed to speak at the meeting. And this was apparently considered unusual because it was the first time in more than 5 years. What was the reason behind this?
Well, here's where I differ a bit with Dr. Go, because I think this appearance reflects the North Koreans' confidence in the course of geopolitical developments. And by that, I mean not just confidence in the support of China and Russia, but also a mounting sense that that Western support for the United States is starting to crack here and there, and that even conservative opinion in America and Western Europe is increasingly sympathetic to Russian and Chinese positions. That's not necessarily an improvement in North Korea's image, of course, but still, I think the North Koreans could be calculating this is a good time to get a wide international hearing for their own case. And that speech was generally a measured one. You know, the North Korean denied that the latest launch threatened the security of North Korea's neighbors. He drew attention to the nuclear submarine in Busan. Now, we can differ with the thrust of his speech, but it was by no means an unreasonable rant. And I think even many Western conservatives who are very unhappy with America's role in the Ukraine conflict are starting to get receptive to that sort of rhetoric. So I think we might see more of this kind of relatively restrained public diplomacy from Pyongyang in the future.
Right, I see. We'll just have to wait and see what happens. Now, unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today's edition, but thank you, Professor Myers, for your insights and your time. Thank you. And thank you, Dr. Go, for your insights. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
All right, that's all for Within the Frame tonight. We'll be back tomorrow with more in-depth stories. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.